Sometimes the loneliest people live in the biggest houses, and sometimes the strongest hearts hide behind the highest walls. In 1880s Texas, wealthy widow Lucinda Hale had everything money could buy, but nothing her soul truly needed, until a starving giant of a man appeared at her gate, asking for nothing more than a meal in exchange for honest work. She fed him out of mercy, but what she got in return was something far more dangerous than she bargained for. Cade Mercer wasn't just any drifter, he was a man with a past that powerful enemies would kill to keep buried. When cattle rustlers and blood feuds threaten everything Lucinda has built, the simple bargain she made with a hungry cowboy becomes a fight for survival, love, and redemption. Will the man she saved end up saving her in return? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Hale Ranch as Lucinda stood on the wraparound porch of her grand stone mansion, coffee cup warming her hands despite the Texas heat already building at 7 o'clock. From this vantage point, she could see for miles in every direction rolling hills dotted with mesquite trees, endless stretches of golden grassland that had once supported thousands of head of cattle, and the winding creek that gave the nearby town its name. Deadman's Creek had earned its grim moniker during the cholera outbreak of '74, but the water still ran clear and cold, sustaining what remained of her empire. She twisted the simple gold band on her left ring finger, a gesture that had become as automatic as breathing in the 3 years since Thomas died. The ring had grown loose on her finger. He'd lost weight in her widowhood, though Rosa insisted on cooking enough food each day to feed a dozen ranch hands. Lucinda couldn't bring herself to remove it, even though well-meaning friends had suggested it might help her move forward. The ring wasn't holding her back, it was holding her together. At 28, she was still young enough to remarry, still beautiful enough to have her pick of suitors from 3 counties. Her auburn hair caught fire in the sunlight, and her green eyes held intelligence that had intimidated more than one would-be husband. But beauty and brains meant little when your heart had turned to stone. Thomas had been her childhood sweetheart, her business partner, her best friend, and her passionate love, all rolled into one remarkable man. When the fever took him, it had taken the best parts of her with him. "Senora Lucinda, you need to eat something more than coffee," Rosa's voice carried from the kitchen doorway. The Mexican woman had been with the family since before Lucinda's marriage, serving first as cook and gradually becoming the closest thing to a mother Lucinda had left. Her own parents had died in a stagecoach accident 2 years before Thomas, leaving her truly alone in the world, except for the handful of people who worked her land. "I'll eat when I'm hungry, Rosa," Lucinda replied, though she knew she'd probably skip breakfast again. Food had lost much of its appeal, becoming mere fuel to keep her body functioning, while she managed the business of staying wealthy and independent in a world designed to make such things impossible for women. The Hale Ranch sprawled across 15,000 acres of some of the best grazing land in Texas, or at least it had been before the drought started. 3 years without adequate rain had turned the abundant grass sparse and yellow. The creek still flowed, but barely, and many of the natural springs that had once dotted the property had dried up completely. Lucinda had been forced to sell off more than half her cattle, keeping only the breeding stock and hoping for better times. Miguel Rodriguez appeared around the corner of the house, his weathered face already showing concern. As her foreman, he carried the weight of trying to keep the ranch profitable in impossible conditions. He'd worked for Thomas since they were both young men, and his loyalty to the Hale family ran deeper than blood. "Morning, Senora," he said, removing his hat as he always did when addressing her. "We lost another calf in the night. Coyotes got past the fence line again." Lucinda sighed, setting down her coffee cup with more force than necessary. Every loss hurt, both financially and emotionally. Each animal represented months of investment, careful breeding decisions, and hope for the future. "How many does that make this month?" "7, Miguel replied grimly. "And that's just the ones we've found. could be more missing out in the far pastures. The ranch that had once employed 30 men now operated with just 8, Miguel, Rosa, and 6 ranch hands who'd stayed loyal, even when Lucinda couldn't always guarantee their wages would come on time. They were good men, hard workers who understood that their fate was tied to hers. If the Hale Ranch failed, they'd all be looking for work in a territory where jobs were scarce and competition fierce. "Any word from Bartholomew Cross?" Lucinda asked, though she dreaded the answer. Cross owned the neighboring spread to the east, and he'd been circling her property like a vulture ever since Thomas died. His offers to buy her out started politely enough, but they'd grown more insistent over the years. Last month, he'd suggested they could solve both their problems through Mariaga business proposition, disguising itself as a romantic overture. "He rode by yesterday while you were in town," Miguel said carefully. "Left another letter." Lucinda's jaw tightened. Cross was persistent, she'd give him that. He was also handsome in a cold, calculating way, successful in his business dealings, and completely without conscience when it came to getting what he wanted. She'd heard stories about homesteaders who'd refused his offers to purchase their land, only to find their cattle mysteriously disappearing or their water sources fouled. Nothing could ever be proven, of course, but the pattern was clear to anyone paying attention. "I suppose he's concerned about my welfare again," Lucinda said with bitter humor. "That's what he said. Also mentioned he'd heard talk in town about rustlers working this area. Thought you should know, for your own safety." The irony wasn't lost on either of them. Cross expressing concern about rustlers was like a fox warning the henhouse about weasels. Still, rustling had become a real problem across the territory. With so many ranchers struggling, some men had turned to stealing cattle rather than watching their families starve. Lucinda couldn't entirely blame them, even as she worked to protect her own interests. "Double the night watch," she decided. "And make sure the boys know to shoot first and ask questions later if they catch anyone on our land after dark." Miguel nodded approvingly. "Si, Signora. What about Cross's letter?" "Burn it with the others." The morning routine continued, with discussions of feed costs, pasture rotation, and maintenance needs for equipment they couldn't afford to replace. Every decision came down to money, how to spend less while somehow maintaining productivity. Lucinda had grown expert at robbing Peter to pay Paul, but even her financial creativity had limits. After Miguel left to organize the day's work, Lucinda remained on the porch, watching the sun climb higher over her struggling domain. The house behind her stood as a monument to better ×3 stories of native stone and imported timber, with gabled windows and ornate woodwork that had cost Thomas a small fortune. The furniture inside came from as far away as New Orleans and Chicago, shipped by rail and wagon at considerable expense. Crystal chandeliers hung in rooms that now went unused most evenings, and Persian rugs covered floors that echoed with the footsteps of just 3 people instead of the large family Thomas had envisioned. They'd planned to have children, of course, lots of them, to fill the bedrooms upstairs and carry on the Hale name. But 3 miscarriages had broken that dream, and then Thomas died before they could try again. Now the house felt like a mausoleum, beautiful and cold and far too quiet. The isolation wore on her more than she liked to admit. Deadman's Creek was 20 miles away over rough roads, far enough that casual visits were impractical. The few women she'd considered friends had gradually stopped coming around after she'd turned down their matchmaking attempts one too many times. She understood their thinking. A woman alone was an anomaly in this time and place, something to be fixed or pitied but not entirely trusted. Her closest neighbor aside from Cross was old German immigrant who spoke broken English and kept to himself. Beyond that, the nearest ranch was 40 miles north, owned by a family she barely knew. In a land where neighbors were supposed to look out for each other, Lucinda had somehow become an island unto herself. She picked up Cross's latest letter from the small table beside her chair, not bothering to open it. She could guess the contents well enough. Another offer to buy her out, another invitation to dinner, another reminder that a woman shouldn't try to run a cattle operation alone. He wasn't entirely wrong about the challenges, But his solutions all involved her surrendering the independence she'd fought so hard to maintain. The morning breeze carried the scent of dust and dying grass, punctuated occasionally by the lowing of cattle in the distance. This land had been in Thomas's family for 2 generations, built through hard work, smart decisions, and more than a little luck. His grandfather had claimed the original homestead during the Republic of Texas days, and his father had expanded it through careful purchases and strategic marriages. Thomas had doubled the size again, through his own efforts, creating an empire that should have lasted for generations. Now it was all balanced on the edge of a knife, dependent on the decisions of one woman who'd never intended to run a ranch but found herself with no other choice. Some days, Lucinda felt equal to the challenge. Other days, like this one, the weight of responsibility threatened to crush her spirit entirely. She finished her coffee and rose to begin the day's business, tucking Cross's letter into her skirt pocket without reading it. There would be ledgers to review, correspondence to handle, and a dozen small crises that required her attention. The work never ended, but it served a purpose beyond keeping the ranch operational. It kept her mind occupied and her hands busy, leaving less time to dwell on what she'd lost and what she feared losing next. As she turned toward the house, Lucinda caught sight of her reflection in the front window. She still looked like the girl Thomas had married, albeit thinner and with worry lines around her eyes that hadn't been there before. But inside, she felt ancient, worn down by responsibilities and sorrows that had aged her spirit far beyond her years. The girl Thomas had loved believed in fairy tales and happy endings. The woman staring back from the glass had learned that life was mostly about endurance, about protecting what little you had left and hoping it would be enough to see you through to whatever came next. She'd built walls around her heart, not out of spite, but out of necessity. Another loss like Thomas would destroy her completely, and she had too many people depending on her to risk that kind of vulnerability again. Still, as she walked back into the cool interior of her grand, empty house, Lucinda couldn't entirely suppress a tiny voice in the back of her mind that wondered what it would be like to feel truly alive again. She'd grown so accustomed to merely surviving that she'd almost forgotten what it meant to actually live. Almost, but not quite. And perhaps that small distinction would prove more important than she could possibly imagine. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly as Lucinda rode her mare, Duchess, along the fence line of the south pasture. The heat shimmered off the ground in waves, making the distant hills dance like mirages. She'd taken to making these inspection rides herself, rather than relying solely on Miguel's reports. There was something about seeing the problems firsthand that helped her make better decisions, even when those problems seemed insurmountable. The fence posts leaned at precarious angles, weathered by years of wind and neglect. Several sections of wire had snapped under the strain of drought-stressed cattle pushing against them in search of better grazing. Each broken strand represented another expense she could barely afford, another task for her already overworked men. Lucinda dismounted to examine a particularly damaged section, running her gloved hands along the twisted metal and calculating the cost of repairs in her head. That's when she saw him. At first, he was just a dark speck moving across the heat-distorted landscape, too far away to make out details. But as he drew closer, walking with the steady, measured pace of a man who'd covered many miles on foot, his size became apparent. He stood well over 6 feet tall, with shoulders broad enough to block out the sun and a frame that spoke of both strength and hard living. His clothes told a story of recent hardship, a once-fine shirt torn at the shoulder and stained with sweat and dust, denim pants worn thin at the knees, and boots that had seen far too many miles without proper care. The wide-brimmed hat shadowing his face was weathered but well-made, the kind of hat a successful man might wear before fortune turned against him. Lucinda remounted Duchess, her hand instinctively moving to the small pistol she carried in her saddlebag. A woman alone in this country couldn't be too careful, especially with a stranger of such imposing size approaching her property. But something about his approach gave her pause. He wasn't skulking or trying to avoid being seen. He walked directly toward her with the purposeful stride of a man who had legitimate business. When he came within 50 yards, he stopped and raised one hand in a gesture of peace. Even at that distance, she could see the hollowness in his cheeks, the way his clothes hung loose on what had once been a more substantial frame. This was a man who hadn't eaten well in some time. "Ma'am," he called out, his voice carrying clearly across the still air. It was a deep, resonant baritone with the cultured accent of an educated man. "I mean you no harm, I'm hoping we might have a word." Lucinda studied him for a long moment, weighing her options. Common sense told her to ride away, to send Miguel back with a couple of armed men to deal with whatever this stranger wanted. But something in his posture, respectful, patient, desperate but not threatening, made her curious enough to stay. "You can speak from there," she replied, keeping her distance but not fleeing. "What do you want?" He removed his hat, revealing dark brown hair that needed cutting and a face that bore the marks of recent suffering. His eyes, she noticed, were a striking pale blue, the color of winter sky. Despite his obvious hardship, there was intelligence in those eyes, and something else, dignity, that poverty hadn't managed to strip away. "My name is Cade Mercer," he said, his voice steady despite what she could now see was near complete exhaustion. "I haven't eaten in 3 days, ma'am. I'm asking if you might spare a meal in exchange for honest work. I can mend fences, break horses, handle cattle, whatever needs doing." The simple honesty of his request caught her off guard. In her experience, men who approached her property usually wanted something more complex to court her, to buy her land, to take advantage of her perceived weakness as a woman alone. This man was asking for nothing more than food and the chance to earn it. "You're a long way from anywhere, Mr. Mercer," she observed. "How did you come to be walking across my land?" A shadow passed across his features, quick but not quick enough to hide entirely. "Lost my horse 2 days back. Snakebite. Been walking since then, looking for work or at least someone willing to trade a meal for labor." It was a plausible story, but Lucinda sensed there was more to it. Something in the way he carried himself suggested this man had once commanded respect, perhaps even authority. His speech was too refined for a simple drifter, his bearing too proud for someone who'd always lived hand to mouth. "I have men who handle the ranch work," she said carefully. "I'm sure you do, ma'am, but I notice your fence there needs attention, and I'd wager there's more work than hands to do it. I'm not asking for charity, just a fair trade." As if to emphasize his point, his stomach chose that moment to growl audibly. The sound carried across the distance between them, and Lucinda saw him flush with embarrassment at this betrayal by his own body. Against her better judgment, she found herself dismounting again. There was something about this man that intrigued her. Perhaps it was the contrast between his obvious desperation and his maintained dignity. Or maybe it was simply that she recognized a fellow soul who'd been battered by circumstances beyond their control. "Show me your hands," she commanded. Without hesitation, he extended both hands toward her, palms up. They were the hands of a working man, calloused, scarred, with the kind of deep tan that came from years of outdoor labor. But they were also clean despite his travels, and his nails were neatly trimmed. Whatever hardship had brought him to her door, he maintained standards of personal care that spoke to his character. "You know horses?" she asked. "Yes, ma'am. Raised and trained them most of my life." "Cattle?" "I've worked my share of drives and roundups." Lucinda looked him over once more, taking in details she'd missed at first glance. The leather saddlebags slung over his shoulder were high quality, though battered by hard use. The buckles were silver, tarnished but expensive. His boots, despite their current condition, had been expertly made. This man had known better times, possibly much better times. "What happened to you, Mr. Mercer?" she asked quietly. For a moment, she thought he wouldn't answer. His jaw tightened, and those pale blue eyes looked past her toward the horizon. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of old pain. "Made some enemies, ma'am. Sometimes being right isn't enough if the wrong people don't want to hear it." It was cryptic, but honest in its own way. Lucinda made a decision that surprised even her. "Can you ride bareback?" "If I have to. Then we'll go back to the house. You'll get that meal, and we'll see what kind of work you can do." She paused, fixing him with a stern look. "But understand this, Mr. Mercery run a respectable operation. Any trouble, any theft, any inappropriate behavior toward my staff, and you'll find yourself walking again with nothing but boot leather between you and starvation. Understood, ma'am? You won't regret this kindness." "We'll see about that." As they made their way back toward the ranch house, Lucinda on Duchess and Cade, walking alongside with the easy stride of a man accustomed to keeping pace with mounted riders, she found herself stealing glances at her unexpected guest. There was a story here. She was certain of it. Men didn't fall from prosperity to begging for meals without reason, and everything about Cade Mercer suggested his circumstances were recent and dramatic. The saddlebags bouncing against his hip looked heavy, as if they contained more than just a few personal belongings. She caught glimpses of papers tucked inside when the leather flaps shifted with his movement letters, perhaps, or documents of some kind. Whatever they were, he guarded them carefully, adjusting the bags whenever they threatened to reveal their contents. Miguel was waiting in the yard when they arrived, his expression darkening as he took in the sight of Lucinda, accompanied by a stranger. His hand moved instinctively to the pistol at his hip, and she could see the questions forming in his eyes. "Miguel, this is Cade Mercer," she announced before her foreman could voice his concerns. "He'll be working for us in exchange for meals. See that he gets fed, then find him something to do." "Signora," Miguel began, but she cut him off with a look. "We need the help, and he needs the work. Sometimes solutions are that simple." But even as she said it, Lucinda knew nothing about this situation was truly simple. She'd invited a mystery into her ordered world, and mysteries, in her experience, had a way of becoming complications. Still, as she watched Cade Mercer carefully set his saddlebags in the shade of the porch and remove his hat once again in her presence, she couldn't bring herself to regret the decision. Perhaps it was the loneliness talking, or maybe it was simply the recognition of desperation in someone else's eyes. Either way, she'd committed herself to discovering what manner of man she'd taken in, and whether her impulsive act of mercy would prove to be salvation for them both, or the beginning of troubles she couldn't yet imagine. Rosa's reaction to Cade Mercer was immediate and telling. The moment Lucinda brought him into the kitchen, the older woman's maternal instincts took over. She clicked her tongue disapprovingly at his gaunt appearance and immediately began pulling food from the pantry, leftover beef from the previous night's dinner, fresh bread still warm from the morning's baking, and a jar of preserved peaches that she'd been saving for a special occasion. "Sit," she commanded, pointing to a chair at the kitchen table with the authority of someone who'd been managing this household since before Lucinda was married. "You look like a scarecrow that's been picked clean by crows." Cade removed his hat and took the offered seat, but Lucinda noticed he waited until she nodded her approval before actually beginning to eat. His manners were impeccable despite his obvious hunger. He used the utensils properly, chewed thoughtfully rather than wolfing down the food, and thanked Rosa quietly between bites. This was a man who'd been raised properly, educated in the social graces that separated gentlemen from common laborers. "Where you from, senor?" Rosa asked as she bustled around the kitchen, already preparing additional portions. "Originally from Virginia," Cade replied after swallowing carefully. "Been in Texas about 5 years now." "Long way from home," Lucinda observed, studying his face for any telltale reactions. "Sometimes a man has to travel far to find where he belongs," he said diplomatically. Miguel appeared in the doorway, his weathered face skeptical as he took in the scene. "Senora, if you have a moment, I'd like a word." Lucinda followed her foreman out to the back porch, where they could speak privately while still keeping an eye on their guest through the kitchen window. "You don't know anything about this man," Miguel said without preamble. "He could be a thief, a murderer." "He could also be exactly what he appears to be," Lucinda interrupted. "A man down on his luck who's willing to work for food. Men like that don't usually carry silver-buckled saddlebags or speak like they've had schooling." Miguel's observation was astute, but it only confirmed what Lucinda had already noticed. So he's had better circumstances in the past. That doesn't make him dangerous. Doesn't make him safe either. Miguel's expression was grave. We've had rustlers working this area, remember? What better way to scout our operation than to get hired on as temporary help? The concern was valid, but something in Lucinda rebelled against Miguel's suspicions. Perhaps it was her own experience of being judged unfairly as a woman trying to run a ranch in a man's world. She'd faced skepticism and assumptions about her capabilities from the moment Thomas died. Maybe she simply recognized the look of someone who'd been knocked down by life and was trying to get back up. Give him a chance, she decided. Put him to work on something where he can't cause trouble if your suspicions are correct. The fence repairs in the south pasture? Maybe. If he's here to scout for rustlers, mending our defenses isn't exactly helping their cause. Miguel still looked unconvinced, but he nodded reluctantly. What about sleeping arrangements? I don't like the idea of a stranger in the bunkhouse with the other men. The old lined shack by the creek is still standing. He can stay there until we know more about him. When they returned to the kitchen, Cade had finished eating and was helping Rosa clear the dishes, despite her protests that he was a guest. The simple courtesy spoke well of his character, though Lucinda reminded herself that charming manners could hide a multitude of sins. "Mr. Mercer," she said, and he immediately turned to face her with the kind of attention a soldier might give his commanding officer. Another interesting detail to file away. Miguel will show you what needs doing. You'll start with fence repairs in the south pasture. Yes, ma'am. I'm grateful for the opportunity. There's an old line shack by the creek where you can sleep. It's not fancy, but it's weatherproof. That's more than adequate. Thank you. As Miguel led Cade away to gather tools and explain the work, Lucinda found herself drawn to the kitchen window, watching the two men head toward the tool shed. Cade's stride was confident, purposeful, with none of the shuffling uncertainty she might have expected from a man who'd been walking for days without food. When Miguel handed him a post-hole digger, he hefted it with the easy familiarity of someone who'd used such tools many times before. "He has good hands," Rosa observed, joining Lucinda at the window, "and he said please and thank you for everything. A man who remembers his manners when he's starving, that says something about his raising." "It says something," Lucinda agreed. "But what exactly?" For the rest of the afternoon, she found excuses to ride past the south pasture, ostensibly checking on other aspects of the ranch operation, but actually observing their new employee. What she saw both impressed and puzzled her. Cade worked with an efficiency that spoke of extensive experience, setting new posts with mathematical precision and stretching wire with the practiced eye of someone who understood that shoddy work would only create bigger problems later. More intriguingly, he'd organized his task in a way that suggested strategic thinking. Rather than simply patching the most obvious breaks, he'd assessed the entire fence line and was systematically replacing the weakest sections first. It was the approach of someone who thought long-term, who understood that preventing problems was more valuable than fixing them after they occurred. When one of the ranch hands, a young Mexican named Carlos, brought water to the work site, Lucinda watched their interaction carefully. Cade thanked the boy courteously and asked intelligent questions about the local cattle, the seasonal patterns of weather, and the challenges the ranch faced. His inquiries were those of someone genuinely interested in understanding the operation, not merely gathering information for nefarious purposes. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, Cade cleaned his tools methodically before returning them to the shed. Another good signman who respected equipment were generally men who could be trusted with responsibility. "How did he do?" Lucinda asked Miguel, as they watched Cade walk toward the creek and his temporary lodgings. "Better than I expected," Miguel admitted grudgingly. "He knows his way around ranch work, I'll give him that. Got more done in one afternoon than some men manage in 2 days. Any concerns?" "Just the same ones I started with. A man with his skills shouldn't be walking from ranch to ranch looking for work. Something drove him to it, and until we know what, we should stay cautious." That evening, as Lucinda sat on her front porch with a cup of coffee, she could see a small fire flickering near the line shack. Cade had apparently found enough dry wood to build a modest campfire, though she noticed he'd been careful to place it where the flames wouldn't be visible from the main road. Another detail that could be interpreted multiple ways: either the caution of a man with something to hide, or simply the wisdom of someone who'd learned to avoid unnecessary attention during hard times. Rosa appeared beside her, carrying a plate covered with a clean kitchen towel. "I made extra biscuits," she said, though they both knew she'd made them specifically for their guest. "Someone should take them to him before they get cold." "You're already mothering him," Lucinda observed with amusement. "A hungry man is a hungry man, no matter what secrets he might be carrying. And that one has secrets. I can see it in his eyes. But I don't think they're the kind that would hurt good people." Lucinda found herself walking toward the creek, the plate of warm biscuits serving as her excuse. The night air was cooler than the day had been, carrying the scent of wood smoke and the distant lowing of cattle settling down for the night. When she approached the line shack, she could see Cade sitting beside his fire, staring into the flames with the expression of a man lost in memories. "Rosa thought you might be hungry," she said, holding out the plate. He looked up, startled from his reverie, and quickly rose to his feet. "That's very kind. Please tell her I'm grateful." As he accepted the biscuits, their hands brushed briefly, and Lucinda was surprised by the warmth of his touch. His hands were clean despite the day's work, and she caught the faint scent of soap he'd washed at the creek before settling in for the night. "You did good work today," she said, unsure why she felt compelled to offer praise. "It felt good to be useful again," he replied simply. Something in his tone made her study his face more carefully in the firelight. There was gratitude there, but also a kind of relief that went deeper than merely having found employment. This was a man who'd been adrift, she realized, possibly for longer than he'd admitted. "Mr. Mercer," she said carefully, "Miguel is concerned that we don't know anything about your background. In the interest of putting his mind at ease, would you be willing to share more about where you've come from?" For a moment, she thought he might deflect the question again, but then his shoulders sagged slightly, as if he was setting down a burden he'd grown tired of carrying. "I owned a spread about 200 miles south of here," he said quietly. "Not as grand as this one, but good land. Built it up over 10 years from nothing but a government claim and a lot of hard work. What happened to it? Sometimes doing the right thing costs more than a man can afford to pay." His voice carried the weight of old pain. "I testified against some men who needed testifying against. They didn't take kindly to it, and they had more friends than I did." It was still vague, but the honesty in his voice convinced Lucinda he was telling at least part of the truth. "So you lost everything?" "Everything except what I could carry in those saddlebags." He gestured toward the line shack, where she could see the leather bags sitting beside the door. "Been drifting since then, looking for a place where a man can start over without his past following him around like a hungry wolf." The metaphor was apt, and it explained much about his cautious demeanor, his careful way of revealing information. Whatever had happened to him, it had taught him that trust was a luxury he couldn't afford. "Well," she said finally, "tomorrow is another day, and there's more fence that needs mending. Get some rest, Mr. Mercer." "Thank you, Mrs. Hale, for the food, the work, and for not asking more questions than I'm ready to answer." As she walked back toward the main house, Lucinda found herself thinking about the Thomas Hale cattle brand that marked everything on her property, the stylized TH that her late husband had designed to represent their family legacy. That brand was more than just a mark of ownership. It was a symbol of everything they'd built together, everything she was now trying to preserve alone. Looking at Cade Mercer, she saw a man who'd once had his own brand, his own legacy, and had lost it all. Perhaps that recognition of shared loss was what made her willing to give him a chance when prudence suggested she should have sent him on his way. Or perhaps she simply needed to believe that people could start over, because her own future sometimes felt just as uncertain as his past. By the end of his first week at the Hale Ranch, Cade had established a routine that impressed even Miguel. He rose before dawn, worked until sunset with only brief breaks for meals, and spent his evenings maintaining his equipment and planning the next day's tasks. The fence line in the south pasture was not only repaired, but reinforced with additional posts that would withstand the next season's storms. Lucinda found herself looking forward to their brief conversations during her daily inspection rides. Cade had opinions about cattle breeding, water management, and pasture rotation that demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of ranch operations. More than once, his suggestions had saved her time and money, though he offered them diffidently, as if unsure of his right to speak. "The creek's running lower than it should be for this time of year," he observed on a particularly hot Thursday afternoon. They were standing near the main watering hole, watching her remaining cattle cluster in whatever shade they could find. "I know. It's been a problem for 3 years now." Lucinda's voice carried the weariness of someone who'd wrestled with an intractable challenge for too long. "Have you considered diverting the flow from the north branch? There's a natural depression about half a mile upstream that could be dammed with relatively little effort. Create a reservoir that would hold water even when the creek runs low." Lucinda studied the landscape he was describing, seeing the possibilities she'd somehow missed despite riding this land for years. That would be expensive. Less expensive than losing cattle to thirst, and the work could be done with the men you have if they're willing to put in some extra hours. She turned to look at him more closely. "You've given this considerable thought." A flush crept up his neck. "I notice things. Hard not to, when you're working the land every day. This is the kind of thinking that built successful ranches, Mr. Mercer. Why haven't you shared these ideas with Miguel?" "Not my place," he said simply. "I'm temporary help, not a partner in the operation." But that evening, Lucinda found herself discussing Cade's water management suggestions with Miguel over dinner. Her foreman listened carefully, asked practical questions about implementation, and grudgingly admitted the plan had merit. "He's not wrong about the benefits," Miguel said, "but I still don't trust him. A man with that kind of knowledge should be running his own spread, not working for day wages. He told me he lost his ranch. Maybe he's just looking for a fresh start. Maybe, or maybe he's here for reasons he hasn't shared yet." The following morning brought an incident that would test Miguel's suspicions and reveal more about their mysterious employee than anyone expected. Lucinda was reviewing account books in her study when Rosa burst through the door, her face flushed with excitement and fear. "Senora, come quickly. There's trouble with the horses." Lucinda followed Rosa outside to find a crowd gathered around the main corral, where her prize stallion, Thunder, was rearing and striking at anyone who approached. The magnificent black horse had been spooked by something during the night and was now in a state of near panic that made him dangerous to himself and anyone nearby. "He's been like this since sunrise," Miguel explained, breathing hard from his own unsuccessful attempt to calm the animal. "Won't let anyone near him, won't take food or water. If we can't settle him down, he's going to hurt himself." Thunder was worth more than most men made in 5 years, a breeding stallion whose bloodline was renowned throughout Texas. But more than his monetary value, he represented Thomas's last major purchase, a symbol of the prosperity and vision that had defined the Hale Ranch in better times. "Should I get the rifle?" asked Carlos, the young ranch hand who'd been working with Cade on the fence repairs. "No," Lucinda said firmly. "There has to be another way." That's when Cade appeared at the edge of the crowd, having heard the commotion from his work site near the creek. He took in the situation at a glance, his pale blue eyes assessing the stallion's behavior with professional interest. "May I?" he asked quietly. Miguel started to object, but Lucinda nodded. They'd tried everything else, and Thunder was working himself into a lather that could prove fatal if it continued much longer. Cade approached the corral fence slowly, his movements deliberate and non-threatening. He didn't try to enter the enclosure or even reach through the rails. Instead, he simply stood at the fence and began to speak in a low, rhythmic voice that somehow carried clearly despite its softness. "Easy, big fellow, easy now. Nobody here wants to hurt you. You're safe. You're among friends." The words were simple, almost mundane, but there was something in Cade's tonea, combination of authority and compassion that seemed to penetrate Thunder's panic. The stallion's ears flicked toward the sound, and his wild thrashing gradually slowed to a nervous pacing. "That's better. Much better. You're a fine horse, aren't you? A king among horses. But even kings need to rest sometimes." As he continued speaking, Cade slowly removed his pocket watch from his vest and let it dangle from its chain, catching the morning sunlight. The gentle, swaying motion seemed to hypnotize the stallion, whose attention became focused on the glinting silver. Lucinda found herself equally mesmerized, not by the watch but by this unexpected side of the man she'd hired to mend fences. His entire bearing had changed from deferential hired hand to someone who clearly understood horses at the deepest level. The transformation was so complete that she wondered who the real Cade Mercer might be. After 20 minutes of patient work, Thunder had calmed enough to accept a handful of oats from Cade's outstretched palm. The stallion's breathing returned to normal, and he allowed himself to be led to the water trough for a much-needed drink. The assembled ranch hands broke into spontaneous applause, but Cade seemed embarrassed by the attention. He quickly pocketed his watch and stepped back from the corral, his posture returning to the humble demeanor of a temporary employee. "How did you do that?" Lucinda asked, genuinely amazed. "Just takes patience and understanding," he replied modestly. "Horses are like people, they act out when they're scared or confused. Give them time to realize you're not a threat, and they'll usually come around." But Miguel had noticed something else. "That was no ordinary horse handling," he said quietly to Lucinda as Cade walked away. "That was the work of a professional trainer, maybe even a cavalry officer." The observation stuck with Lucinda throughout the day. That evening, she made her usual trip to the line shack with leftovers from dinner, but this time her curiosity got the better of her discretion. "That was impressive work with Thunder today," she said as Cade accepted the plate of food. "Just doing what needed doing. Where did you learn to work with horses like that?" For a moment, she thought he might deflect the question, as he had so many others, but then he seemed to reach some internal decision. "My father bred horses for the Confederate cavalry during the war," he said quietly. "I grew up around some of the finest animals in Virginia. After the war, when everything else was gone, horse training was one of the few skills that still had value." It explained much about his bearing, his refined speech, and his natural authority. The son of a Confederate horse breeder would have grown up with advantages of education and social position, only to see them stripped away by war and its aftermath. "The war ended 20 years ago," Lucinda observed gently. "Some wounds take longer to heal than others." His voice carried a weight that suggested personal as well as regional scars. As he spoke, Cade absently pulled out his pocket watch to check the time, and in the firelight, Lucinda caught a glimpse of the engraving on its case. The ornate script was hard to read, but she could make out what looked like the initials CM, followed by other letters that didn't quite match what she expected. "That's a beautiful watch," she said, hoping to encourage him to reveal more. Cade looked down at the timepiece as if surprised to find it in his hand. "It belonged to my father," he said carefully. "One of the few things I managed to save when I lost the ranch." But something in his tone suggested the story was more complicated than that simple explanation. The watch was expensive, the kind of heirloom passed down through generations of prosperity. Yet the initials she'd glimpsed didn't seem to match the name he'd given her. As she walked back to the main house, Lucinda found herself wondering how many layers of truth surrounded Cade Mercer. He'd revealed more about himself tonight than in all their previous conversations combined, yet she sensed that deeper mysteries remained. The man who could calm a panicked stallion with nothing but his voice and a pocket watch was clearly more than he pretended to be. The question was whether those hidden aspects of his identity represented a threat to her and her ranch, or simply the private pain of someone who'd learned that the past could be a dangerous burden. Either way, she was beginning to realize that her simple act of charity in feeding a hungry stranger had introduced complications into her life that she was only beginning to understand. But as she prepared for bed that night, Reviewing the day's events and the growing list of improvements Cade had suggested for the ranch, Lucinda had to admit that complications weren't necessarily unwelcome. For the first time in 3 years, she felt as though she had a true partner in the challenge of keeping the Hale Ranch profitable and secure. Whether that partnership would prove to be her salvation or her downfall remained to be seen. But either way, the loneliness that had defined her widowhood was beginning to lift, replaced by something that felt suspiciously like hope. 3 weeks into Cade's employment, the rustling problem that had plagued the area for months suddenly escalated. Lucinda lost 4 head of prime breeding stock in a single night, stolen so skillfully that the thieves left barely any tracks. The financial blow was devastating, but the psychological impact was worse. It felt like a violation of everything she'd worked to preserve. They knew exactly what they were taking, Miguel reported grimly as they surveyed the empty pasture where the stolen cattle had been grazing. Bypassed the older steers and took only the young bulls and best heifers. Someone's been watching us, learning our patterns. Cade stood quietly at the edge of the group, studying the ground with the intensity of a man reading a book. When he finally spoke, his observations were precise and troubling. 4 men on horseback, leading pack animals. They came from the east, worked quickly, and knew where to find the stock they wanted. This wasn't opportunistic theft, it was planned. "How can you tell all that from a few hoof prints?" Carlos asked, clearly impressed despite himself. "The depth of the impressions tells you how many riders and whether they were carrying extra weight. The spacing shows they were moving with purpose, not wandering around looking for targets. And the direction they came from suggests they had a specific destination in mind." Miguel nodded grimly. "The east border runs along Cross's property." The implication hung in the air like smoke from a grass fire. Bartholomew Cross had been pressuring Lucinda to sell for months, growing more insistent as her financial situation became increasingly precarious. Cattle rustling was an old tactic for forcing struggling ranchers into bankruptcy, especially when the stolen animals conveniently disappeared without trace. That afternoon, as if summoned by their suspicions, Cross himself arrived at the ranch. He rode up to the main house with 2 of his men, their horses fresh and their equipment expensive. Everything about Cross's presentation was calculated to demonstrate his prosperity and power, from his silver-trimmed saddle to the pearl-handled revolvers at his hips. "Lucinda, my dear," he called out as she emerged from the house to meet him. "I heard about your recent troubles. Terrible business, cattle rustling. A woman alone shouldn't have to deal with such dangers." Bartholomew Cross was a handsome man in his early 40s, with silver threading through his dark hair and the kind of confident bearing that came from never having faced serious adversity. His ranch was twice the size of hers and 3 times as profitable, built through a combination of shrewd business practices and methods that skirted the edges of legality. "Mr. Cross," Lucinda replied coolly, not inviting him to dismount. "What brings you by today?" "Neighborly concern, nothing more. These rustlers have been working the entire area, you know. I've lost some stock myself, though fortunately I have enough men to patrol my borders properly." The implication was clear: her operation was vulnerable because she couldn't afford adequate security. "I appreciate your concern, but we're managing." Cross's smile was condescending. "Of course you are, my dear. But perhaps it's time to consider whether struggling alone is truly in your best interests. My offer to purchase your land still stands, and I'd be willing to increase it by 10% given your recent difficulties. My land isn't for sale. Everything is for sale at the right price, and prices tend to drop when cattle keep disappearing." His tone remained friendly, but the threat was unmistakable. That's when Cade appeared from around the corner of the house, carrying a saddle that needed repair. He moved with the casual purposefulness of someone going about his daily work, but Lucinda noticed how his eyes took in every detail of Cross's group, their weapons, their positioning, their body language. Cross noticed him too, his gaze sharpening with interest. "New employee, Lucinda. I thought you were cutting expenses." "Mr. Mercer is helping with repairs and maintenance," she replied carefully. "Mercer." Cross repeated the name as if testing its flavor. "Don't believe I know any Mercers in these parts. Where are you from, friend?" Cade set down the saddle and straightened to his full height, which put him at eye level with Cross, despite the other man being mounted. "Here and there," he replied evenly. "A man goes where the work is." "Indeed. And what kind of work brings you to Mrs. Hale's ranch?" "The honest kind." The response was mild, but something in Cade's tone made Cross's men shift uncomfortably in their saddles. There was a quality to his stillness that suggested coiled strength, like a rattlesnake deciding whether to strike. Cross studied Cade for a long moment, clearly trying to place him or assess the potential threat he represented. Finally, he turned back to Lucinda with renewed determination. "Well, I won't keep you from your business, but do think about my offer, won't you? These are dangerous times for isolated ranches. It would be tragic if something happened that could have been prevented." After Cross and his men rode away, Lucinda found herself standing alone with Cade in the ranch yard. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the ground, and somewhere in the distance she could hear Miguel calling instructions to the other hands. "He knows something about the rustling," Cade said quietly. "I suspect as much, but suspecting and proving are different things. Men like that don't usually do their own dirty work. They hire others to handle the unpleasant details while keeping their own hands clean." Lucinda looked at him sharply. "You sound like you've encountered his type before." "Once or twice." Cade's expression was carefully neutral. Rich men who want something you have tend to use similar methods to get it. That evening, as Lucinda reviewed her account books by lamplight, she found herself thinking about Cross's visit and the barely concealed threats he'd delivered with such polished courtesy. The numbers on the pages told a stark story. She could absorb the loss of 4 head of cattle, but not many more. If the rustling continued at its current pace, she'd be bankrupt within 6 months. Rosa appeared in the doorway with a cup of coffee and a worried expression. "That Cross man makes my skin crawl," she said without preamble. "He looks at you like you're a prize horse he's planning to buy. I'm not for sale any more than the ranch is." "Maybe not, but desperate people sometimes make choices they wouldn't consider in better times." It was an uncomfortable truth. Lucinda had sworn never to remarry, never to put herself in a position where a man could control her fate again, but Thomas had been her equal, her partner in every sense. Cross would expect a wife who deferred to his judgment, who brought her property into his empire, and then stepped aside while he managed it. The thought made her physically ill, but she couldn't deny that marriage to Cross would solve her immediate financial problems. His wealth could absorb the losses from rustling, his political connections could provide protection she couldn't afford on her own, and his business acumen might preserve what Thomas had built, even if it meant she'd have no say in how it was managed. As if summoned by her troubling thoughts, she noticed a light moving near the line shack where Cade stayed. Curious, she wrapped a shawl around her shoulders and walked out into the cool night air. She found him sitting by a small fire, but instead of staring into the flames as usual, he was examining what looked like a surveyor's map spread across a makeshift table made from a wooden crate. The map was marked with various symbols and notations, and she could see property lines clearly delineated in different colors. "Interesting reading?" she asked, approaching carefully so as not to startle him. Cade looked up, and for a moment she saw something flash across his features: surprise, perhaps even guilt, before his usual composed expression returned. "Found this blowing around near the east fence line," he said, though something in his tone suggested the discovery hadn't been entirely accidental. "Thought you might want to see it." Lucinda moved closer to examine the map, and what she saw made her blood run cold. It was a detailed survey of her property and the surrounding area, with her land clearly marked in red and various notations indicating water sources, grazing areas, and potential access points. Most disturbing were the penciled calculations in the margins, figures that looked suspiciously like estimates of land value and cattle inventory. "This is Cross's work," she said with certainty. "That would be my guess. The paper's expensive, and the surveying is professional quality. Someone spent considerable money having this prepared. But why would he need such detailed information about my property if he's simply interested in buying it?" Cade was quiet for a moment, studying the map with the same intensity he'd brought to reading the rustler's tracks. Could be he's planning to make you an offer you can't refuse. Hard to negotiate effectively when the other party knows your resources better than you do. The implication was chilling. If Cross had detailed knowledge of her financial situation, her cattle inventory, and her property's vulnerabilities, he could time his pressure campaign with devastating precision. He'd know exactly when she'd be most desperate, most likely to accept whatever terms he offered. "There's something else," Cade said, pointing to a series of marks along her eastern border. "These look like planned access routes. Someone's been thinking about how to move cattle off your land quickly and quietly. You think he's behind the rustling?" "I think he's behind more than that. This kind of planning takes time and money. He's not just waiting for you to fail, he's actively working to make it happen." As they studied the map together, Lucinda became acutely aware of Cade's presence beside her. He smelled faintly of wood smoke and leather, and when he leaned closer to point out a particular detail, she could feel the warmth radiating from his body. It had been a long time since she'd been this close to a man, and the awareness was both unsettling and oddly comforting. "What do you think I should do?" she asked quietly. "Fight back," he said immediately. "Men like Cross count on intimidation and isolation to get what they want. Show him you won't be pushed around, and he might look for easier prey. Easy for you to say. You don't have everything you own at stake." Cade was quiet for so long that she wondered if she'd offended him. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight of personal experience that made her reconsider her assumption. "Actually, Mrs. Hale, I know exactly what it feels like to watch everything you've built slip away piece by piece, and I know what it costs to give up without a fight. Sometimes the only choice is to stand your ground and see what happens, even when the odds are against you." There was something in his tone that made her study his profile in the firelight, seeing not just the hired hand who'd appeared at her gate asking for food, but a man who'd clearly faced his own battles and bore the scars to prove it. For the first time since their first meeting, she felt as though she was seeing the real Cade Mercer, whoever he truly was, beneath the carefully maintained facade. "Will you help me?" she asked, surprised by her own boldness. "Any way I can," he replied without hesitation. "You gave me a chance when I needed one. I won't forget that kindness." As they folded up the map and prepared to return to their respective quarters, Lucinda found herself hoping that Cade's loyalty was as genuine as it appeared. Because if Cross was truly orchestrating a campaign to force her off her land, she was going to need all the allies she could find. The drought that had plagued the region for 3 years reached a new level of severity in the following weeks. The creek that gave Deadman's Creek its name dwindled to a muddy trickle, and the natural springs that had sustained cattle through previous dry spells went completely dry. Lucinda watched her remaining herd cluster around the few remaining water sources, their ribs beginning to show, despite her efforts to provide adequate feed. "We're going to have to sell more cattle," Miguel announced during their morning meeting. "Can't feed what we can't water." The mathematics were brutal but inescapable. Each day of drought meant higher feed costs and lower cattle prices, as other ranchers faced the same impossible choices. Cross's offer to buy her land was beginning to look less like opportunism and more like financial salvation, even though she suspected his motives were far from pure. Cade had been working on the water diversion project he'd suggested, organizing the ranch hands into an efficient team that managed to dam the north branch of the creek and create a small but reliable reservoir. The work was backbreaking, requiring them to move tons of stone and earth by hand, but the results were already showing promise. "It's not enough to solve all our problems," he admitted as they stood beside the newly completed dam. "But it should buy us time to find other solutions." Lucinda watched the water building slowly behind the earthen barrier, creating the first new source of irrigation her ranch had seen in years. "You keep saying us," she observed. "This is temporary work, remember. You'll move on when something better comes along." Cade was quiet for a moment, his pale blue eyes focused on the distant horizon. "Maybe I'm tired of moving on," he said finally. "Maybe I've found something worth staying for." The comment hung between them like a question waiting to be answered, But before Lucinda could respond, Carlos came galloping up from the south pasture with news that drove all other considerations from her mind. "Signora, there's been trouble. Someone ran off with 6 more head, and they left something behind for you to find." What they'd left behind was a crude sign hammered into the ground where the stolen cattle had been grazing. "Sell out or lose everything." The message was unsigned, but its intent was unmistakable. Someone was escalating the pressure campaign against her, moving from theft to outright intimidation. "This has gone beyond rustling," Miguel said grimly. "This is warfare." Cade studied the sign and the surrounding area with the same methodical attention he'd brought to previous thefts, but this time his findings were different. "They wanted to be seen," he announced after completing his examination. "Left clear tracks leading toward Cross's property, made sure the sign would be easily found. Either they're getting careless, or this is meant to provoke a response." "What kind of response?" Lucinda asked. "The kind that would give Cross an excuse to escalate further. If you ride onto his property making accusations you can't prove, he can claim you're the aggressor. Might even involve the sheriff, paint you as an hysterical woman who can't handle the pressures of ranch life." The strategy was diabolically clever, and it confirmed Lucinda's growing suspicion that Cross was orchestrating events with considerable sophistication. He wasn't just stealing her cattle, he was manipulating her into making mistakes that would justify whatever he planned to do next. That evening, as the household settled into its nightly routines, Rosa approached Lucinda with a troubled expression and a piece of paper clutched in her weathered hands. "I found this when I was cleaning Mr. Mercer's clothes," she said quietly. "It fell out of his shirt pocket, and I couldn't help but see what it was." The paper was a fragment of what had once been a larger document, torn roughly along 3 edges. What remained showed part of a printed illustration, the man's face rendered in the stark black and white of a wanted poster. The face was partially obscured by the tear, but enough remained to show strong features and penetrating eyes that looked disturbingly familiar. Below the illustration, partial text was visible: "Wanted for murder and assault. Reward, 500. The rest was missing, torn away, or faded beyond reading. Lucinda's hands trembled as she studied the fragment. The partial face could belong to any number of men, but something about the eyes, the set of the jaw, reminded her powerfully of Cade. If this was indeed a wanted poster bearing his likeness, it would explain his mysterious past, his reluctance to discuss his background, and his obvious skill with weapons and tactics. "What should we do?" Rosa asked nervously. "Nothing for now," Lucinda decided, though her mind was racing with implications. "Don't mention this to anyone else. I need time to think." But thinking proved difficult when her thoughts kept circling back to the same troubling questions. If Cade was a wanted man, what crimes had he committed? More immediately, did his presence on her ranch put her and her people in danger? And perhaps most disturbing of all, how much of what he'd told her about himself was true? She couldn't sleep that night, pacing her bedroom while trying to reconcile the man she'd come to know with the possibility that he was a fugitive from justice. The Cade she'd observed was hard-working, respectful, and genuinely concerned about her welfare. He'd shown kindness to Rosa, patience with the younger ranch hands, and protective instincts that seemed entirely sincere. But criminals could be charming when it served their purposes, and wanted men often developed elaborate false identities to evade capture. The thought that she might have been deceived so completely made her feel naive and vulnerable. Near midnight, she made a decision that went against every instinct for self-preservation she possessed. Wrapping a robe around her nightgown, she walked out to the line shack where Cade was staying. She found him sitting by his usual small fire, but tonight he wasn't alone. Thunder, the stallion he'd calmed weeks earlier, stood nearby, apparently having wandered over from the main corral. The horse was nuzzling Cade's shoulder with obvious affection, and Cade was speaking to him in the same low, gentle voice she'd witnessed during the earlier crisis. "Couldn't sleep either?" she asked, stepping into the circle of firelight. Cade looked up, unsurprised by her appearance. Horses are good company when a man's got things weighing on his mind. What kind of things? For a long moment, she thought he wouldn't answer. Thunder snorted softly and moved away, apparently sensing the tension between the two humans. Finally, Cade reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out what looked like the remaining portion of the wanted poster Rosa had found. "I suppose you're wondering about this," he said, holding up the paper so she could see it clearly in the firelight. Lucinda's breath caught in her throat. The complete poster showed Cade's face unmistakably, along with text that made her blood run cold. "Wanted for murder and assault, Cade McKinnon, reward, 500. Extremely dangerous." "McKinnon," she whispered, "not Mercer." "No, ma'am. Cade McKinnon is my real name. Mercer was my mother's maiden name, seemed as good a new identity as any when I needed to disappear." Lucinda took an involuntary step backward, her hand moving instinctively toward the small pistol she carried. "You lied to me about everything." "Not everything, just the parts that would have gotten me shot or hanged before you had a chance to know who I really am." "And who are you really? A murderer? A criminal?" Cade's expression was grave, but not defensive. "I'm a man who killed another man in what any reasonable person would call self-defense. Unfortunately, the dead man had friends in high places, and reasonable people weren't the ones deciding whether to press charges." "Tell me what happened." "The short version? I witnessed a corrupt sheriff taking bribes from cattle rustlers. When I tried to testify about what I'd seen, he and 2 of his deputies came to my ranch with the intention of making sure I never made it to court. I managed to kill the sheriff and wound one of the deputies before they could finish the job, but the survivor told a different story, made it sound like I'd ambushed them without provocation. The explanation had the ring of truth, but Lucinda had learned to be skeptical of convenient stories from wanted men. "Why should I believe you?" "Because you've seen how I behave when I think no one's watching. Because I've had opportunities to rob you, hurt you, or take advantage of your situation, and I haven't. Because the man you hired to mend fences is the same man standing here now. The only thing that's changed is what you know about my past." It was a compelling argument, but the wanted poster in her hands was compelling evidence of danger. $500 is a lot of money. Someone thinks you're dangerous enough to pay that much for your capture. Dead or alive, according to the fine print, which tells you something about whether they want me to stand trial or just disappear permanently. Lucinda studied his face in the flickering firelight, searching for signs of deception or malice. What she saw instead was a bone-deep weariness, the look of a man who'd been carrying a heavy burden for far too long. "If what you're telling me is true, why didn't you keep running? Why stay here, where someone might recognize you?" Cade was quiet for so long that she wondered if he would answer at all. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Because I'm tired of running. Because I've found something here worth the risk of being caught. Because for the first time in 2 years, I feel like I'm building something instead of just surviving day to day." The admission hung between them like a bridge she could either cross or burn. Lucinda knew that harboring a wanted man put her entire operation in jeopardy. If the law caught up with Cade while he was working her ranch, she could face charges as an accomplice. Her reputation, already precarious as a woman running a cattle operation alone, would be destroyed completely. But she also knew that without Cade's help, she might lose the ranch anyway. His knowledge, his work ethic, and his protective instincts had become integral to her chances of surviving Cross's campaign against her. Sending him away might be the legally prudent choice, but it would also eliminate her best hope of keeping what Thomas had built. "I need time to think about this," she said finally. "I understand. And Mrs. Hale, whatever you decide, I'm grateful for what you've given me these past weeks. It's been the closest thing to a home I've had since I lost my ranch." As she walked back toward the main house, Lucinda carried with her the image of Cade sitting alone by his fire, the wanted poster still clutched in his hand. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new pressures from Cross, and new decisions about whom she could trust in a world where even the most straightforward relationships seemed layered with deception and danger. But tonight, for the first time since Thomas died, She didn't feel entirely alone with her burdens. Whether that feeling was born of wisdom or foolishness remained to be seen. The telegram arrived on a Tuesday morning with the kind of bureaucratic efficiency that could destroy lives in a single sentence. Sheriff William Hayes rode out from Deadman's Creek personally to deliver it, his weathered face grim with the burden of unwelcome news. "Morning, Lucinda," he said, dismounting his horse with the careful movements of a man whose joints protested long rides. Hayes had been sheriff for 15 years, and he'd known Thomas well enough to consider himself a family friend. "I'm afraid this isn't a social call." Lucinda accepted the yellow telegraph paper with hands that trembled slightly. She'd been expecting something like this, ever since her conversation with Cade 3 nights earlier. But expectation didn't make the reality any less devastating. "Wanted man Cade McKinnon, believed working your area. Stop extremely dangerous. Stop reward. 500 dead or alive. Stop notify immediately if sighted. Stop." The message was signed by a U.S. Marshal named Robert Dalton, operating out of San Antonio. Below the official text, someone had added a handwritten note. "Known associates include cattle rustlers and murderers. Do not attempt apprehension alone." "You know anything about this McKinnon fellow?" Hayes asked, watching her face carefully for reactions. Lucinda forced herself to meet his eyes steadily. "Should I? Word is he might be working as a ranch hand somewhere in this area, using a false name probably. Could be dangerous for whoever's employing him, assuming they don't know his real identity." The sheriff's tone was casual, but Lucinda could sense the undercurrent of suspicion. Hayes was nobody's fool, and he'd survived 15 years of law enforcement by learning to read people's faces when they lied. "I'll keep an eye out," she said carefully, "though with all the drifters looking for work, it's hard to know everyone's background." "Indeed it is. Mind if I have a look around? Talk to your men, see if anyone matches the description." It wasn't really a request, and they both knew it. Lucinda nodded reluctantly, her mind racing as she tried to figure out how to warn Cade without arousing further suspicion. "Miguel can show you around," she offered. "I need to check on some sick cattle in the north pasture." Hayes nodded, but his pale grey eyes suggested he wasn't entirely convinced by her eagerness to leave. "Much obliged. I'll try not to disrupt your operation more than necessary." As Lucinda saddled Duchess with hands that shook more than she cared to admit, she could hear Hayes questioning Miguel about recent hires. Her foreman's responses were careful and truthful lies. They'd hired a temporary hand named Cade Mercer, but he was out working the far fence lines and wouldn't be back until evening. The lies came so naturally that Lucinda wondered when she'd become so comfortable with deception. 3 months ago, she would have turned Cade over to the authorities without question, regardless of his explanations about corrupt sheriffs and self-defense. Now, she found herself willing to risk everything to protect a man she'd known for less than 2 months. She rode hard toward the section of fence where Cade was working, pushing Duchess to her limits across the rough terrain. When she finally spotted him, he was absorbed in replacing a broken post, his shirt soaked with sweat, despite the morning coolness. He looked up at her approach, and something in her expression must have warned him, because his entire posture changed. "What's wrong?" he asked immediately. "Sheriff's here, looking for you." She thrust the telegram toward him, watching his face as he read the damning words. Cade's reaction was complex, part resignation, part anger, and underneath it all, a weariness that spoke of months or years of looking over his shoulder. "How long do I have?" "Not long." He's questioning the men now. "Miguel told him you wouldn't be back until evening, but he's not stupid enough to believe that if he really wants to find me." Cade folded the telegram carefully and handed it back to her. "Mrs. Hale, I want you to know that everything I told you about what happened was true. I killed a man, but it was him or me, and I'd make the same choice again." "I believe you," she said, surprising herself with the conviction in her voice. "Then you're either very wise or very foolish, and I'm not sure which." "Neither am I." Lucinda looked back toward the ranch, where she could see a distant cloud of dust that probably marked Sheriff Hayes beginning his search. "What will you do?" "What I've been doing for 2 years, disappear and start over somewhere else. It's gotten easier with practice. The casual way he said it broke something inside her chest. This man who'd worked so hard to help save her ranch, who'd shown nothing but loyalty and competence and unexpected gentleness, was about to walk out of her life as suddenly as he'd entered it. There might be another way, she heard herself saying. Cade looked at her sharply. What do you mean? Bartholomew Cross. He's been behind the rustling, the pressure to sell. What if the real criminals were caught? What if the law had bigger problems to worry about than one wanted poster? You're talking about vigilante justice. That's not your fight. It became my fight when he started stealing my cattle and threatening my livelihood. And if you're innocent of the charges against you, then catching the real criminals might be the only way to clear your name. Cade was quiet for a long moment, considering the implications. It's dangerous. Cross has money, political connections, hired guns. Taking him on directly would be like declaring war. Maybe it's time for a war. I'm tired of being pushed around, tired of watching everything Thomas built slip away piece by piece while I try to play by rules that don't apply to people like Cross. As if summoned by their conversation, the sound of approaching hoofbeats made them both turn. Sheriff Hayes appeared over a low rise, riding directly toward their position with the purposeful movement of a man who'd found what he was looking for. Too late to run, Cade said quietly. Mrs. Hale, whatever happens next, I want you to know that working here has been the best part of my life in a long time. Don't let my troubles destroy what you're trying to build. Cade McKinnon, Hayes called out when he was still 50 yards away. I need you to step away from Mrs. Hale and keep your hands where I can see them. Cade complied immediately, moving several paces away from Lucinda and raising his hands to shoulder height. His movements were calm, controlled, showing no sign of the desperation or violence Hayes clearly expected. Sheriff, Cade said respectfully as Hayes approached with his weapon drawn, I assume you're here about that poster. I am indeed. You're under arrest for the murder of Sheriff Dan Costner and the attempted murder of his deputies. You have the right to remain silent, though I'd advise you to start talking if you want to see the inside of a jail cell instead of a pine box. The man I killed was taking bribes from cattle rustlers, Cade said steadily. I was willing to testify about it in court until he decided I needed to be silenced permanently. Hayes snorted derisively. That's what they all say. Costner was a good man, served his community faithfully for 20 years. Then why did he come to my ranch at night with 2 armed men instead of serving a proper warrant during daylight hours? Because he had reason to believe you were dangerous. Turns out he was right. As Hayes moved to place shackles on Cade's wrists, Lucinda found herself speaking before her rational mind could stop her. Sheriff, what if I told you I had evidence that the real cattle rustlers are still operating in this area? What if the crimes Cade was trying to report are still happening? Hayes paused, his attention shifting to her. What kind of evidence? Lucinda thought of Cross's surveyor's map, the coordinated pattern of thefts from her ranch, and the escalating intimidation campaign that had culminated in the threatening sign. None of it would stand up in court by itself, but together it painted a picture of organized criminal activity, the kind that might interest a U.S. Marshal more than one wanted poster, she said carefully. Now you listen here, Lucinda, Hayes said, his tone growing stern. I know you're upset about your cattle being stolen, but that doesn't give you the right to harbor a wanted murderer. This man is dangerous, and he's been deceiving you from the moment he set foot on your property. Has he? Because the man I hired has done nothing but honest work, helped improve my operation, and shown more integrity than some supposedly respectable members of this community. Hayes's expression darkened. Are you accusing me of something? I'm suggesting that maybe the real criminals are the ones with enough money and influence to avoid wanted posters, while men like Cade get hunted for defending themselves against corruption. It was a dangerous accusation, one that could make her an enemy of the very law enforcement she might need to protect her. But as she watched Cade standing there with quiet dignity, accepting his fate without protest, she realized she'd already chosen her side in this conflict. Hayes finished shackling Cade and prepared to lead him away. Mrs. Hale, I strongly advise you to reconsider any involvement in this man's troubles. Harboring a fugitive is a serious crime, and I'd hate to see you face charges alongside him." As they rode away, Cade looked back once, his pale blue eyes meeting hers across the growing distance. In that moment, Lucinda made a decision that would either save them both or destroy everything she'd worked to preserve. She was going to prove Cade's innocence by exposing the real criminal Seven, if it meant taking on Bartholomew Cross and everyone connected to his operation. The scared, cautious widow who'd been content to merely survive was gone, replaced by a woman willing to fight for what she believed in. The war Cross had been waging against her was about to become a battle he'd never expected, and this time she had nothing left to lose. The jail in Deadman's Creek was a stone building that had seen better days, with iron bars thick enough to hold the most determined prisoner and walls that absorbed sound like a tomb. Lucinda sat on the narrow bench outside Cade's cell, having spent most of her remaining cash to convince the deputy to allow her a private conversation. "You shouldn't be here," Cade said quietly, his hands wrapped around the bars that separated them. "Association with me will only hurt your reputation further." "My reputation is the least of my concerns right now." Lucinda leaned forward, lowering her voice to ensure they wouldn't be overheard. "I've been thinking about what you said regarding Cross and the rustling. What if we could prove he's behind it? What if we could show that the corruption you witnessed extends all the way to this county?" Cade's expression was skeptical. "Even if we could prove it, what good would that do? I'm still wanted for murder, and Cross has enough influence to make any accusations disappear." "Not if the evidence was overwhelming, not if it was presented to the right people." Lucinda pulled out a folded paper from her reticule. "I sent a telegram to the U.S. Race Marshal's office in Austin this morning. Told them I had information about organized cattle rustling that might connect to other cases they're investigating." Cade studied her face with a mixture of admiration and concern. "You're playing a dangerous game, Mrs. Hale. Cross won't take kindly to federal interference in his business." "Then we'd better make sure we have enough evidence to put him away before he realizes what we're doing." Lucinda's voice carried a determination that surprised even her. "Miguel is watching his movements, documenting the timing of every theft, every visit to my ranch. Rosa is keeping track of which cattle have gone missing and when, and I've been studying that surveyor's map, looking for patterns." "What have you found?" "Cross isn't just stealing cattle randomly. He's targeting specific bloodlines, animals that would be valuable for breeding. Someone with that map could plan thefts months in advance, knowing exactly when and where to find the most valuable stock." Cade nodded grimly. "Organized rustling rings often work that way. They study ranchers' operations for months, learning routines and identifying the most profitable targets. But proving it requires catching them in the act." "Then that's what we'll do." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Deputy Marshal James Crawford, a lean man in his 40s who wore his authority with quiet confidence. Sheriff Hayes led him to the cell, his expression suggesting he wasn't entirely pleased by the federal intervention. "Mr. McKinnon," Crawford said without preamble, "I've reviewed your case file, and I have some questions about the circumstances surrounding Sheriff Costner's death." "I'll answer anything you want to know," Cade replied steadily. Crawford pulled out a notebook and began asking detailed questions about the events leading up to the shooting. His inquiries were thorough and professional, focusing on specific details that could be verified independently. More importantly, he seemed genuinely interested in Cade's version of events rather than simply confirming the existing charges. "Mrs. Hale," Crawford said, turning his attention to Lucinda, "Sheriff Hayes tells me you believe there's ongoing criminal activity in this area that might relate to Mr. McKinnon's case." "I do, and I have evidence to support that belief." Over the next hour, Lucinda presented everything she'd gathered: Cross's surveyor's map, the documented pattern of thefts from her ranch, the intimidation tactics, and the escalating pressure to sell her land. Crawford listened carefully, asking pointed questions and taking detailed notes. "This is certainly suggestive," he said finally, "but it's largely circumstantial. To make charges stick against someone with Cross's resources and connections, we'd need more direct evidence. What kind of evidence? Lucinda asked. Witnesses to actual crimes, documented proof of coordination between different criminal activities, physical evidence linking Cross directly to the thefts. Sheriff Hayes shifted uncomfortably. Deputy Marshal, with all due respect, Bartholomew Cross is a pillar of this community. These accusations are based on the word of a wanted murderer and a woman who's clearly been under considerable stress. Crawford's expression remained neutral, but Lucinda caught a subtle tightening around his eyes that suggested Hayes's defense of Cross had been noted and filed away. Nevertheless, Sheriff, these allegations deserve investigation. Mrs. Hale, would you be willing to cooperate in gathering additional evidence? Anything you need. It could be dangerous. If Cross is as ruthless as you suggest, he won't hesitate to eliminate threats to his operation. Lucinda thought of her father's derringer, the small but deadly weapon she'd inherited, along with his fierce independence and refusal to be intimidated by bullies. Her father had built his own ranch from nothing, defending it against rustlers, hostile weather, and men who thought a German immigrant had no business owning prime Texas land. Deputy Marshal, she said quietly, I've already lost my husband, most of my cattle, and nearly everything else that mattered to me. I'm not about to lose what's left without a fight. Crawford nodded approvingly. Then here's what we're going to do. Mr. McKinnon will remain in custody for now, but I'm suspending any transfer to stand trial pending the outcome of our investigation. Mrs. Hale, you'll return to your ranch and continue your normal operations, but you'll also be our eyes and ears. Document everything, every visit from Cross, every theft, every suspicious activity. What about protection? Cade asked, his concern for Lucinda evident. If Cross realizes she's working with federal marshals, he might decide she's too dangerous to leave alive. I'll have men positioned where they can respond quickly if needed. But Mrs. Hale, you need to understand that you'll be essentially acting as bait. Are you prepared for that risk? Lucinda thought of Thomas, of the dreams they'd shared for their ranch and their future together. She thought of the cattle that had been stolen, the threats that had been made, and the gradual erosion of everything she'd worked to preserve. Most of all, she thought of Cade, sitting in a jail cell for the crime of defending himself against corruption. I'm prepared, she said firmly. Over the next 3 days, Lucinda threw herself into the role of federal informant with the intensity of someone who had nothing left to lose. She documented every suspicious incident, every unusual visitor, every change in the behavior of neighboring ranchers who might be connected to Cross's operation. Miguel and Rosa proved invaluable allies, their loyalty extending beyond simple employment to genuine concern for her safety and success. Miguel used his connections, among other ranch hands, to gather information about Cross's activities, while Rosa kept careful records of everything that happened at the Hale Ranch. Senora, Rosa said on the third evening, I think someone has been watching the house. I've seen the same rider on the hills 3 times today, always keeping his distance but never quite going away. Cross is getting nervous, Miguel added. Word is, he's been asking questions around town about your meeting with the federal marshal. He knows something's changed. That night, Lucinda sat on her front porch with her father's derringer in her lap, watching the darkness for signs of movement. The small weapon had been a gift from her father on her 16th birthday, along with lessons in its proper use and a stern lecture about when such extreme measures might be necessary. A gun is like a promise, he'd told her in his accented English. You never make promise you're not willing to keep. So you never draw gun unless you're ready to use it, and you never use it unless someone's life depends on it. Tonight, she felt closer to that threshold than she'd ever been before. Cross's surveillance suggested he was planning something, and she doubted it would be another polite offer to purchase her land. Her suspicions were confirmed the following morning when Cross himself arrived at her ranch, but this time he brought more than just 2 men. 6 riders accompanied him, all armed and displaying the kind of casual menace that professional gunfighters cultivated like a trade skill. Lucinda, my dear, Cross called out as she emerged from the house to meet him. I understand you've been entertaining some rather unsavory visitors lately. Federal marshals, men asking questions about your neighbors. I'm concerned that you might be getting involved in matters that are beyond your understanding. My understanding seems adequate for my needs, Mr. Cross. Does it? Because I hear that you've been making accusations about cattle rustling, suggesting that respectable members of this community might be involved in criminal activities. That's a dangerous path for a woman in your position. Cross's tone remained conversational, but the threat was unmistakable. His men had spread out in a semicircle around the yard, their positions calculated to control any escape routes. This wasn't a social call, it was an ultimatum. I've simply been cooperating with law enforcement, Lucinda replied carefully. Surely you don't object to citizens helping catch criminals. I object to wild accusations based on the word of wanted murderers and desperate women who've lost touch with reality. Sometimes grief and financial pressure can cause people to make poor decisions, to see conspiracies where none exist. Miguel appeared from the barn, his hand resting casually near his pistol. Behind him, she could see Carlos and two other ranch hands taking positions that would give them clear fields of fire if violence erupted. Her men were outnumbered, but they had the advantage of knowing the terrain and fighting for something they believed in. Mr. Cross, Lucinda said, her voice steady despite the tension crackling through the air. I think it's time for you to leave my property. Cross's smile was cold and reptilian. I think it's time for you to reconsider your recent choices very carefully. Federal marshals can't protect you all the time, and accidents happen to isolated ranches more often than you might expect. As Cross and his men rode away, Lucinda realized she'd crossed a line from which there was no retreat. The war she'd declared was about to begin in earnest, and the outcome would determine not just her survival, but whether justice could prevail in a system designed to protect men with money and power. That evening, as she cleaned her father's derringer and checked its ammunition, she thought about the promise her father had taught her about guns. Tomorrow, she suspected, she might have to decide whether she was ready to keep that promise. The attack came at dawn, when the light was still grey and uncertain, and most honest people were just beginning their daily routines. Lucinda was in the kitchen with Rosa, drinking coffee and reviewing the previous day's intelligence reports, when Miguel burst through the door, with his face flushed from hard riding. They're coming, he announced breathlessly. Cross and at least a dozen men, maybe more. They're moving fast, like they mean to finish this today. Lucinda felt her pulse quicken, but her voice remained steady. How long do we have? 20 minutes, maybe less. They're coming from 3 directions to surround us before we can react. Rosa crossed herself and began muttering prayers in Spanish, but she also moved to the gun cabinet where Thomas had kept his rifles. Whatever was about to happen, she intended to be ready for it. Send Carlos to town immediately, Lucinda instructed. Tell him to find Deputy Marshal Crawford and report what's happening here. The rest of us will hold them off as long as we can. Senora, Miguel said carefully, there are only 5 of us. Cross has brought enough men to fight a small war. Then we'll fight a small war. Lucinda checked her father's derringer one final time, ensuring the ammunition was fresh and the mechanism clean. This is my land, my home. I won't be driven off by threats and intimidation. As Miguel ran to organize their defenses, Lucinda found herself thinking about Cade, sitting in his jail cell 20 miles away, helpless to participate in the battle that would determine both their fates. She'd promised to prove his innocence, but first she had to survive long enough to present whatever evidence they might uncover. The sound of approaching hoofbeats grew louder, and she could see dust clouds rising from multiple directions as Cross's forces moved into position. Whatever his plan, he'd coordinated it carefully, bringing enough firepower to ensure there would be no survivors to contradict his version of events. Mrs. Hale, Cross's voice carried clearly across the ranch yard. I'm here under the authority of Sheriff Hayes to arrest you for harboring a known fugitive and interfering with law enforcement. Surrender now, and you'll be treated according to the law. It was a clever lie, giving his attack the veneer of legal authority while eliminating witnesses who could testify about his criminal activities. But Lucinda had learned to recognize the difference between law and justice, and she doubted Cross intended for her to live long enough to stand trial. "Show me your warrant," she called back, buying time while Miguel and the others took their positions. "The warrant is in my saddlebags. Come out with your hands raised, and I'll be happy to show it to you." Instead of complying, Lucinda moved to a window that gave her a clear view of the yard. Cross sat his horse in the center of a group of armed men, but something was wrong with the picture. His usual confident demeanor seemed strained, and he kept glancing toward the eastern horizon as if expecting something. That's when she saw the second dust cloud, smaller but moving faster than Cross's group. Someone else was approaching the ranch, and from Cross's reaction, it wasn't part of his plan. The approaching riders resolved into Deputy Marshal Crawford and 3 other federal agents, their horses lathered from hard riding. They must have received Carlos's message and ridden through the night to reach the ranch in time. "Mr. Cross," Crawford called out as his men took positions that effectively surrounded the rustlers. "By the authority of the United States Marshal Service, you and your men are under arrest for cattle rustling, intimidation, and conspiracy to commit murder." Cross's face went white, then red with fury. "This is outrageous. I'm here on official business, trying to arrest a woman who's been harboring fugitives and making false accusations against respectable citizens. The only false accusations here are the ones in that fake warrant you're carrying." Crawford replied calmly. "We have evidence linking you to organized cattle rustling throughout this region, including detailed plans found in your office last night." The revelation hit Cross like a physical blow. While he'd been preparing his assault on the Hale Ranch, federal agents had been searching his property and uncovering the evidence needed to destroy his entire operation. "You have no right," Cross began, but Crawford cut him off. "We have every right, and we have the evidence to support it, including this." Crawford held up a worn leather journal that Lucinda recognized. Immediately it was similar to the one Thomas had kept to record ranch business, but this one clearly belonged to someone else. "This is the personal journal of Sheriff Dan Costner," Crawford announced. "Found hidden in your office safe, Mr. Cross. It contains detailed records of bribes received, rustling operations coordinated, and plans to eliminate witnesses who threatened to expose the corruption." Cross's men began to shift nervously, realizing they'd been caught in a trap that was closing rapidly around them. Several of the hired guns started edging their horses away from the group, clearly calculating their chances of escape. "Among other things," Crawford continued, "Sheriff Costner wrote extensively about his concerns regarding a rancher named Cade McKinnon, who had witnessed too much and needed to be silenced. The journal makes it clear that Costner and 2 deputies went to McKinnon's ranch not to arrest him, but to murder him and make it look like he'd resisted arrest. The implications were staggering. If Costner's own journal proved that Cade had killed in self-defense, then the murder charges against him were fraudulent. More than that, it meant the entire network of corruption extended far beyond simple cattle rustling." "This is impossible," Cross sputtered. "Costner would never have kept records of criminal activities." "Apparently, he didn't trust his partners to honor their agreements," Crawford replied dryly. "Insurance, you might say. Unfortunately for you, insurance policies sometimes end up in the wrong hands." Lucinda watched from her window as the confrontation unfolded, her heart pounding with hope and fear in equal measure. Crawford's arrival had saved her from immediate violence, but Cross and his men were still armed and desperate. Desperate men were capable of almost anything. Her fears proved justified when Cross suddenly drew his pistol and fired at Crawford, the shot echoing across the ranch yard like thunder. The federal marshal dove from his horse as bullets began flying from multiple directions, turning the organized arrest into a chaotic gun battle. "Get down!" Miguel shouted, as windows shattered under the impact of stray bullets. "They're fighting like cornered rats." Lucinda crouched below the windowsill, her father's derringer clutched tightly in her hands. The small weapon wouldn't be effective at long range, but if any of Cross's men made it to the house, she intended to make them pay dearly for the privilege. The gunfight seemed to last forever, though it probably continued for less than 5 minutes. When the shooting finally stopped, 4 of Cross's men lay dead in the yard. 3 others had surrendered, and Cross himself had taken a bullet in the shoulder that left him cursing and bleeding but very much alive. "It's over," Crawford called out. "Mrs. Hale, you can come out now. It's safe." As Lucinda emerged from the house, she saw Deputy Marshal Crawford holding Sheriff Costner's journal like a sacred text. The leather-bound book represented more than just evidence. It was proof that justice could prevail over corruption, that truth could survive even when powerful men tried to bury it. But more than anything, it was Cade's ticket to freedom and the vindication he'd been seeking for 2 long years of running and hiding. The real murderer had been exposed, not through violence, but through his own words, carefully preserved in a journal he'd never intended anyone else to read. The interrogation of Bartholomew Cross took place in the same jail where Cade had been held, but the circumstances were dramatically different. Cross sat in shackles, his wounded shoulder bandaged, but his pride still intact, refusing to answer questions about his criminal enterprise. "You have nothing," he insisted, despite the mountain of evidence Crawford had assembled. "That journal could have been forged, planted in my office by your people. No jury will convict a respected businessman on such flimsy proof." Crawford smiled grimly. "Actually, Mr. Cross, we have considerably more than Sheriff Costner's journal. While you were busy planning your assault on Mrs. Eclice Hale's ranch, my men were interviewing your former associates. Funny how cooperative people become when they realize they're facing federal charges." Over the next hour, Crawford methodically destroyed Cross's denials with testimony from rustlers who'd been caught in previous raids, ranch hands who'd witnessed suspicious activities, and even Cross's own bookkeeper who'd kept detailed records of payments to corrupt officials. "Your operation was impressive," Crawford admitted. "Cattle stolen from struggling ranchers, sold through intermediaries to buyers in other states, with local law enforcement paid to look the other way. You might have continued indefinitely if you hadn't gotten greedy." "I don't know what you're talking about." "No? Then perhaps you can explain these." Crawford produced a stack of letters written in Cross's own handwriting, each one detailing payments to various officials and outlining plans for acquiring specific properties through intimidation and theft. "Where did you get those?" Cross demanded, his composure finally cracking. "From your office safe, along with Sheriff Costner's journal. It seems you both had the same idea about keeping insurance policies in case your partnership went sour." Lucinda watched the interrogation from the hallway, marveling at how quickly Cross's empire had crumbled once federal authorities began pulling at the loose threads. The man who'd seemed so powerful and untouchable was revealed to be nothing more than a common criminal with expensive clothes and political connections. "Mrs. Hale," Crawford said, stepping out of the interrogation room, "I believe we have everything we need to clear Mr. McKinnon of all charges. The evidence clearly shows he acted in self-defense against corrupt officials who intended to murder him. When will he be released?" "Within the hour. The charges against him are being formally dropped, and I'll personally ensure that his name is cleared with law enforcement agencies throughout the territory." As if summoned by their conversation, Sheriff Hayes appeared at the end of the hallway, his face grim with the knowledge that his world was about to change dramatically. The revelation of Costner's corruption had implicated several other officials, and Hayes was struggling to maintain his authority while federal agents investigated his department. "Mrs. Hale," he said stiffly, "I owe you an apology. It appears I was wrong about Mr. McKinnon's guilt and your accusations against Cross." "Apology accepted, Sheriff. We all make mistakes when we don't have complete information." Hayes nodded gratefully, clearly relieved that she wasn't going to press the matter. "If there's anything I can do to help repair the damage to your operation—" "There is something," Lucinda interrupted. "I want a full investigation into every cattle theft in this area over the past 2 years. Every rancher who lost stock to Cross's operation deserves justice and compensation." "Of course, whatever you need." An hour later, Cade walked out of his cell, a free man, the charges against him officially dismissed, and his name cleared of all wrongdoing. Lucinda was waiting for him in the sheriff's office, holding the hat he'd been wearing when he was arrested. "Mrs. Hale," he said quietly, accepting the hat with hands that weren't entirely steady. "I heard what you did, the risks you took to prove my innocence. I don't have words adequate to express my gratitude." "Then don't try," she replied, surprised by the emotion in her own voice. "Just tell me you're planning to stay. The Hale Ranch needs a good foreman, and I can't think of anyone more qualified for the position." Cade's pale blue eyes searched her face, looking for confirmation that she meant what she was saying. "Are you offering me a permanent job?" "I'm offering you a partnership, half ownership in the ranch, equal say in all decisions, and a chance to build something that will last." "That's very generous, but I'm not sure I can accept such." "It's not charity, Cade. It's a business proposition. I need someone I can trust completely, someone who understands cattle ranching and isn't afraid to fight for what's right. In return, you get a home, a future, and a share in whatever success we can build together." Before Cade could respond, Crawford appeared with a final piece of news that would change everything for both of them. "Mr. McKinnon, Mrs. Hale, I thought you'd like to know that Cross has decided to cooperate fully with our investigation. He's provided a written confession detailing his entire operation, including the names of every official he bribed and every crime he committed." Crawford handed them a document several pages long, written in Cross's distinctive handwriting and signed with a flourish that seemed almost defiant. The confession was complete and damning, outlining years of systematic corruption that extended throughout the county and beyond. "Why would he confess?" Lucinda asked. "He had nothing to gain from cooperation." Actually, he had everything to gain. Federal prosecutors were prepared to seek the death penalty for his role in Sheriff Costner's murder conspiracy. By confessing and providing evidence against his co-conspirators, he's negotiated a sentence of 20 years in federal prison instead of hanging. It was rough justice, but justice nonetheless. Cross would spend the rest of his productive years behind bars, his criminal empire destroyed and his reputation ruined. More importantly, the confession would prevent any future questions about Cade's innocence or the legitimacy of their evidence. As they walked out of the jail together, Lucinda found herself thinking about the journey that had brought them to this moment. 3 months ago, she'd been a lonely widow, struggling to preserve her late husband's legacy while fighting off threats from all directions. Now she stood beside a man who'd become her partner in every sense of the word, with their enemies defeated and their future secure. "So," Cade said as they reached their horses, "partners." "Partners," she confirmed, extending her hand to seal the agreement. But instead of shaking her hand, Cade lifted it to his lips and kissed it gently, a gesture that spoke of respect, gratitude, and something deeper that neither of them was quite ready to name. "In that case," he said with the first genuine smile she'd seen from him since the day they met, "I suppose we'd better get back to the ranch. We have a lot of work to do, and for the first time in years, I'm looking forward to doing it." As they rode toward home together, Lucinda couldn't help but think that sometimes the most important bargains were the ones you never saw coming, like feeding a hungry stranger and discovering that generosity could change both your lives in ways you never imagined possible. 6 months later, the Hale Ranch, now officially renamed the Hale McKinnon Ranch, had transformed into one of the most prosperous operations in 3 counties. The water reservoir Cade had designed not only survived the ongoing drought, but provided irrigation for expanded crops that supplemented their cattle income. The stolen livestock had been recovered and returned, along with compensation from Cross's seized assets that allowed them to rebuild their herd to pre-drought levels. Lucinda stood on the front porch of the main house, watching Cade work with a group of new horses they'd purchased from a breeder in San Antonio. His skill with the animals continued to amaze her, but she'd grown accustomed to discovering new depths to the man she'd hired to mend fences and who'd ended up mending her heart as well. The transformation hadn't happened overnight. Trust, once broken by deception and secrets, had required patience and consistent action to rebuild. But gradually, as they worked side by side to restore the ranch's prosperity, their partnership had deepened into something neither had expected when they'd made their original bargain. "Senora," Rosa called from the kitchen doorway, The padre is here for the final preparations. Father Miguel Santos was an elderly priest who'd known Thomas and had officiated at Lucinda's first wedding 8 years earlier. His presence today represented not just religious tradition, but continuity with the past and hope for the future. "How are you feeling?" he asked as Lucinda joined him in the parlor where Thomas's portrait still hung above the fireplace. "Nervous," she admitted. "Happy, but nervous." "That's natural. Second marriages require different kinds of courage than first ones. The innocence is gone, replaced by wisdom that comes from understanding how precious and fragile love can be." Lucinda looked up at Thomas's painted face, searching for signs of disapproval or blessing. What she found instead was the memory of his voice on the night before he died, when fever had made him delirious, but his love had remained clear. "Promise me," he'd whispered, "that you won't spend the rest of your life alone. Promise me you'll find someone who makes you happy, who deserves the love you have to give." She'd promised, though at the time she'd been certain it was a vow she'd never be able to keep. Thomas had been her entire world, her partner in every dream and ambition. The idea that someone else could fill that role had seemed impossible. But Cade hadn't tried to replace Thomas or erase his memory. Instead, he'd helped her build something new on the foundation of what had come before, honoring the past while creating space for a different kind of future. "I think he would approve," Father Santos said, following her gaze to the portrait. "Thomas always wanted you to be happy. He wouldn't want his memory to become a prison that kept you from living fully." The wedding ceremony took place in the main room of the house, with all the ranch hands present, along with friends from town who'd supported Lucinda through her darkest days. Deputy Marshal Crawford had made the trip from Austin to serve as Cade's best man, bringing with him official confirmation that Cade's name had been cleared from all law enforcement records. Miguel walked Lucinda down the improvised aisle, his weathered face glowing with pride, as he delivered her to the altar Father Santos had arranged near the fireplace. Rosa wept openly, her joy at seeing her surrogate daughter find happiness again, overwhelming her usual composure. Cade waited at the altar, wearing a new black suit that Rosa had insisted on purchasing, despite his protests that his old clothes were adequate. The formal attire transformed him from ranch foreman to gentleman, though Lucinda knew she would have married him in his work clothes if necessary. The vows they exchanged were traditional in form, but deeply personal in meaning. When Cade promised to love and honor her in prosperity and adversity, in times of plenty and times of want, Lucinda thought of the desperate man who'd appeared at her gate, asking for nothing more than a meal in exchange for honest work. When she promised to stand beside him through whatever trials the future might bring, she thought of the courage it had taken for him to trust her with the truth about his past, and her own courage in choosing to believe in his innocence when everyone else saw only a wanted criminal. The rings they exchanged were simple gold bands, but they carried symbolic weight that went far beyond their monetary value. Thomas's ring had represented the dreams of youth, the optimism of two people who believed their love could conquer any obstacle. These new rings acknowledged that love was more complex and fragile than youthful passion suggested, but also more enduring when built on mutual respect and shared adversity. "By the power vested in me, by the state of Texas and Almighty God," Father Santos intoned, "I now pronounce you husband and wife. Cade, you may kiss your bride." The kiss was gentle, reverent, a promise of devotion rather than a claim of possession. When they separated, Lucinda saw in Cade's eyes the same wonder she felt at finding love when they'd both given up hope of such happiness. The celebration that followed was modest but heartfelt, with Rosa's cooking and Miguel's guitar providing the foundation for an evening of genuine joy. As the sun set over the ranch that had brought them together, Lucinda and Cade sat on the front porch steps, watching their guests dance in the yard while crickets provided natural music. "Any regrets?" Cade asked quietly, his arm around her shoulders. "Only that it took us so long to get here," she replied, leaning into his warmth. "The timing was right. We both needed to become the people we are now before we could appreciate what we have together." It was true. The scared, desperate man who'd begged for food wouldn't have been ready for partnership and love. The bitter, isolated widow who'd trusted no one couldn't have opened her heart to the possibilities Cade represented. They'd needed their separate journeys through hardship and loss to become people capable of building something lasting together. "What do you think will happen now?" Lucinda asked, gesturing toward the ranch that stretched out before them in the gathering darkness. "Now we work. We build. We face whatever comes together. The way partners should." Cade paused, then added with a smile she could hear in his voice. "And we remember that sometimes the best things in life start with the simplest requests. A hungry man asking for food, a lonely woman deciding to show mercy to a stranger." As if summoned by their conversation, thunder appeared from the direction of the corral, the magnificent stallion approaching with the confident stride of a horse who knew he was welcome. He nuzzled Cade's shoulder affectionately, then did the same to Lucinda, accepting them both as part of his extended family. "Even he approves," Lucinda laughed, scratching behind Thunder's ears. "He's got good judgment for a horse, probably better than most people." As the evening wound down and their guests began to depart, Lucinda found herself thinking about the journey that had brought them to this moment. 6 months ago, she'd been a woman alone, fighting to preserve her late husband's legacy while battling forces that seemed determined to destroy everything she'd worked to protect. Tonight, she was a wife again, but more importantly, she was half of a partnership built on mutual respect, shared adversity, and the kind of love that grew stronger under pressure rather than weaker. The ranch that had once felt like a burden she bore alone was now a shared enterprise, a foundation for whatever the future might bring. "Ready to go in?" Cade asked as the last guests rode away. In a moment, Lucinda looked up at the stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky, thinking of Thomas and the dreams they'd shared, of her father and the lessons he'd taught her about courage and independence, of all the people who'd helped shape her into the woman she'd become. "Thank you," she whispered to the night air, speaking to everyone who'd contributed to this moment of happiness. Then she took her husband's hand and walked with him into the house they would now share, ready to begin the next chapter of a story that had started with the simplest bargain of all: food for work, mercy for a stranger, trust offered when it was most needed and least expected. Sometimes the most important journeys began with a single step taken by someone who had the courage to choose kindness over caution, hope over fear, love over the safer but lonelier path of isolation. Tonight, as Lucinda fell asleep in Cade's arms, she knew with absolute certainty that every risk had been worth taking, every leap of faith justified by the solid ground they'd found together. The giant cowboy who'd asked for nothing more than a meal had given her everything she'd never known. She wanted partnership, security, and a love deep enough to last whatever storms the future might bring. And in return, she'd given him the only things that truly mattered: a home, a future, and the kind of unconditional acceptance that could heal even the deepest wounds. It was, she thought drowsily, exactly the kind of bargain that made life worth living.